I am your host, Jason Hopcus, and honored to have Dr. Denzel Wilson with us today. Dr. Wilson is a therapist working in private practice at Empowered Healing Dallas, a group practice located in Dallas, Texas. He specializes in utilizing a relational, trauma informed, and affirmative therapeutic approach to support and guide LGBTQIA plus folks as they heal and navigate various concerns related to coming out, dating, boundary setting, family and relationship dynamics, and self discovery. Dr. Wilson works collaboratively to help folks reach a deeper understanding and acceptance of themselves in a world that often minimizes queer experiences. Welcome, Dr. Wilson. It's a pleasure to have you here today at Nobody's Perfect Community. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing quite well. How are you?
Well, I'm great. I'm great. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. I know when you and I had connected about this originally, we talked about some work that you had done in your dissertation for your doctorate studies. And the topic today is really around technology use among youth and helping educate youth and parents around kind of some of the dangers and the pitfalls that we see around this. But I'd love to hear a little more from your words, kind of what your passion and interest was in doing this work as you were going through schooling, and help us tee up the conversation and why it's important to have it.
Yeah. So I started my bachelor's degree at UT Dallas, and I was a part of a lab where we did research on adolescent behavior in terms of how they communicated with one another through
Okay.
text messaging. And I was a student in that lab, and what I was tasked with, my role there was to basically code through the text messages that people were sending one another. Then we got to look at what types of conversations teens were having with their peers, with their parents, with their family members who were probably uncles, aunts, cousins, that kind of thing,
Okay.
as well as other people that they were connected with in their lives, like mentors as well. And we got to see just how their way of connecting and how their way of texting shifted and changed, and what kind of things they spoke about versus chose not to, depending on who they were speaking with. So that's kind of what started my interest in technology and adolescent development. And then when I got to my doctoral degree, I ended up focusing my dissertation on a similar topic, which was looking at how technology can facilitate a lot of connection and positive experiences with other people in our lives, but also how it can be a source of negative harm and things that might not necessarily be as desired. So I looked at how people tend to abuse their partners through the use of technology, or continually have access to their partners in an abusive manner with technology, looking at how they might use social media to impersonate their partners, or to coerce their partners, or to basically monitor their partner's location and things like that, as
Right.
a way to stay in connection with them. And so I took a lot of time to do a lot of research in that area, and that's kind of what has sparked that interest.
Okay.
And a lot of the research that I looked at the impetus for my dissertation was rooted in how adolescents use technology to also either bully one another, or to stalk and to coerce other people that they were in connection with as well.
Which sounds like such meaningful and important work. And if I'm understanding you, I mean, aside from the really beautiful gifts that technology brings us in connection, there are some dark sides to that sort of connection. And really, it is kind of the heart of the conversation I'd love for us to have today. Like some of the negative impacts, I can imagine you mentioned that you got to go through and code and read text messages youth were having. What did you learn from doing that? Because I'm guessing it was eye-opening around some of the conversations that people were having. What were some patterns that you saw in how youth were engaging with one another's and people in their peer groups or their family groups?
Yeah, I think one of the main things that we found at the time was that teens were really like proactive in their ability to offer social support to one another in a very positive way, but also in terms like offering advice and guidance to one another, and also directing their peers to other sources of support if they needed that, if they kind of detected that from their friends or from where else they were speaking to, which is a really great adaptive thing. There was also, like I mentioned earlier, like there was some bullying that was happening as well. And so it was interesting to see just how they were bullying one another and what they were saying. And because sometimes we would see one person's like text messages with one peer, and also see them connect with another person about that other peer they were speaking with, kind of seeing how they spoke about the ways that they interact with one another with someone else was also quite interesting to see. And so it kind of illuminated that there's a lot of, like you said earlier, benefits to technology and also ways that teenagers maybe not aren't given enough credit in terms of how they use it, but also how there are some harmful ways that teenagers might use technology in different ways to enact harm. And that's only probably grown with the advent of social media, and how frequently folks are using that as a medium now, as opposed to just using their phones, like in that study.
Well, and I love what you just shared with us that really validates the importance and the value of having these tools for communication. And what we have learned through the study and research that we've done in my organization really validates the fact that youth do rely on their peers and peer groups as a primary source of support. In fact, survey data tells us it was the number one place of support that youth relied on in the beginning. And I can imagine how powerful that is. But what we also learned is a lot of times youth are supporting each other with, perhaps not the best information. People can only meet you from their own place of understanding and experience. And I don't think it's ill-intended or there is any ill will behind it. But the reality is that peer support, while there are many positive benefits to it, is not always the most helpful line of defense when somebody is struggling. Our role here is really to educate parents and youth around the effects of things that we're being faced with day in and day out, and how it can lead to detrimental or negative consequences with our mental health. Like, what do you think has evolved when you look at this, this societal pressure that's been put on us with technology in relation to our mental health? Like, what are you seeing in the work that you do around how is this impacting us?
I think one of the main things that I've seen across the board has been a sense of continual access to someone else.
Okay.
And that can be something that is positive, but also something that can be a bit harmful to a connection that you have with someone too, if they're kind of wanting some distance or if they're not wanting to engage. And I think it's also shifted, like to my earlier point around bullying, just how much more accessible someone is to be bullied by someone else or to be harmed by someone else when they have through or through text messaging and that kind of thing. So that's one of the main ways that I've seen like technology kind of shift and change how we interact with each other. And that sometimes people might have a sense of urgency around response time from someone because now we can see when someone's online, we can see when we can see where people are.
Right.
So that kind of gives like more of a impact on how we feel connected to each other, how our attachment systems are activated, or how our nervous systems are activated as well whenever we see someone that we want to connect with, but they're not responding, but we can see that they're online or posting or chatting with other people. So it can create a sense of distress among a lot of people. And sometimes teens can feel that quite heavily too.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm assuming that, can be a precursor to all of the things we know youth were struggling with, depression, anxiety, social pressure to fit in, which can lead to bullying, can lead to many negative consequences of that. Is that accurate?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this conversation is so important because I go back to the reality of, technology has given us many gifts to be able to connect and have this perceived connection to people. But as we well know, there is no replacement for this face-to-face connection like we're having here today. And I've also found that, being able to hide behind your screen or your keyboard emboldens a lot of people to really show up in a way that might not be their real personality. Do you find people are more free flowing with their commentary or how they show up and approach somebody else because they don't have to have face-to-face interaction with them?
Absolutely. Yeah, the ability to have the anonymity is really something that can be really quite empowering, as you're saying, for some folks to say what they maybe wouldn't say otherwise, either in person or if they are actually using like their main account. One of the things that has really come up recently is people making different accounts. So they might have multiple accounts that they can use. And some folks and a lot of teens that I work with have mentioned that they have fake accounts or they have alternate accounts that they
Right.
use to post other things that they don't want to be seen on their main account. And so on that other account, they can then show up a bit more differently. And to your point, we all have a persona that we tend to embody when we are online versus when we're in person.
Right.
And that can also grow as well if we're also adding more of an anonymity aspect to that as well, where people don't know who we are. And so we can be much more emboldened and much more empowered to speak on things that and say things to people that we wouldn't normally say otherwise.
Right. I just wonder why as humans we are so I'm going to use the word afraid. I don't know that there's not a better word for it, but why are we afraid of just really embracing the authenticity of who we are and like leaning into that, like these creating kind of fake profiles and these different personas to me seems like a miss from reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in a world that really shames authenticity sometimes. Some people aren't as easily as embraced or as welcomed whenever they share their pure thoughts and their opinions about things as well, especially when it comes to like who they're speaking to sometimes. I think safety also plays a role in that too. So kind of wanting to feel safe. Sometimes people feel like they have to step away from how they normally show up or how they normally show up and engage with folks to be able to express themselves. Because making different accounts isn't a negative thing all the time,
No,
because they're like who have really grown in their ability to, show up in a different way with an audience online versus how they show up in their main accounts. So they can kind of go twofold. But yeah, I think that there's like a strong maybe sense of shame that might come up for some folks, or a sense of wanting to really be themselves and not have to worry about people saying anything to them or getting any kind of negative feedback about how they show up or what they might want to post versus not post or subscribe to versus what they don't subscribe to.
of course, of course. Have you observed any, common fears or misconceptions that parents have regarding teens and their technology use? Because what I have found in the work that we've done, and I've worked with a lot of parents and with youth, there's something that I think is really important calling out. Most parents of today's generation are technology adaptives, and youth are technology natives. And there is a disconnect there. And we hear from parents over and over, like, my kid knows so much more than I do. I don't understand what they're doing. Have you seen some things that really show up in a similar way in these conversations?
Yeah, I love the way that you talked about technology natives versus technology adapters, because that is a disconnect that I've actually seen quite a bit among the parents of the teens that I work with, and also just what's in the world, because that does impact, how much someone is comfortable using technology versus not, and because teens are more native to using technology, they're much more likely to turn to that for different things and turn to that maybe a lot more frequently for aspects of life than information that they can get versus other ways of doing that people who are older and people with parents might not necessarily turn to. So there can kind of be, I think a part of that too is maybe the way technology has grown and advanced over time. And changed over time, that maybe preconceived notions that we might have had about technology before maybe don't hold the same way, or they kind of induce more fear around how teens are using technology now versus how parents might have used it when they were younger or otherwise.
Right.
Um,
So if I'm a parent and I'm listening, like, how do I set healthy boundaries with my teens around something that I may not even fully understand how they're navigating or using it? Like, what's the common ground here that kind of brings us back together to a parent being able to understand what their kid's doing online and their online presence, and a kid feeling safe to have those conversations with their parents? Like, how do we set healthy boundaries here?
Yeah. Well, I think just like with any kind of boundary, I think it's important to know to start with at least what is the boundary that you're wanting to set. And with we're interacting with a child, with a teenager, I think it's important to collaboratively define what that boundary is. So really getting an idea of, is there a limit of time you want to have your child to have access to the internet, or do you have an expectation or desire that they follow you or that you follow them?
Right.
Um, have an expectation that's not the case. Um, and so I think kind of getting an idea of maybe what you're wanting to communicate and kind of wanting to set as a boundary, and then communicating that, and also being open to hearing your teenager's opinions about that too, because
Right.
they're
That's what
also
a
open.
conversation is.
Exactly.
It
There's a
goes
back
both
and forth.
ways.
Yes, a bidirectional interaction. And like I said earlier, sometimes teens don't get enough credit sometimes about how they navigate the world that they live in and how they navigate technology use. And so I think it's important to also, in terms of like knowing your child as well, like to allow them to also share with you what they hope that boundaries can look like with you as well, because that can also open the door for a much more collaborative and open process as opposed to the opposite, which would be like imposing rules or regulations without any kind of communication at all.
So what I'm hearing from you is that this collaborative approach really is, it has value and benefit in recognizing that there are two parts of the story. I'm thinking about all the work that we've done with teens specifically, and how over and over again they have validated that they want to have conversations with their parents, and they also often don't know how to do that. So, that's why I'm fond of us having conversations like this and really being able to hopefully bridge the gap between, what we're hearing from youth and what we're hearing from parents. And the fact of the matter is, there is this chasm between them that has some form of disconnect. And I think a lot of it stems from, the development and integration of technology in kids' lives. And often there's a pulling away. And when you talk about setting healthy boundaries, I'm wondering if one of the initial setting of a healthy boundary is really around the amount of screen time that your youth is actually engaged in screen or technology use.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely is a factor as well, especially because we're around screens all the time. Like you and
Right.
I are speaking right now.
Right.
And,
And most kids
screen.
are using them at school all day.
Exactly. I was about to say the same thing. Yeah. Like that they're in schools now as well. Like even just looking at a TV as a screen. So I think being thoughtful about which types of screens you're also considering as screen time is important as well, because yeah, they're having to engage with that at school quite a bit too. And a lot of the curriculum, a lot of the tests are also that they have to take for standardized testing is also on a laptop now or
Right.
online. And so that also impacts a lot of how they show up in the world. And so to your
That's a
point,
really
like
great point, though. I want to reiterate that. Determining what types of screen and what you are monitoring, and recognizing that so much of their world is screen time focused, that what we're talking about here today is really the time that your downtime or your free time or time that you should be doing other things that you're not. That's the screen time I think we're really talking about monitoring, or maybe setting some healthy boundaries around. Is that accurate?
yes. Mhm.
So, I think it's important for anybody listening to really understand the context of what we're saying here. I mean, again, this is not to vilify technology. It has many wonderful gifts. My hope is that we're helping bridge some of these conversations to get a better understanding and education, and really recognize that parents are wanting to connect differently with their youth, maybe, and youth are wanting to connect with their parents. And how do we meet in the middle and have those healthy conversations around that? The thing that I want to get back to a little bit is, you talked earlier about your work that kind of led you to doing this, and really kind of studying the consequence of how youth were interacting. And you'd mentioned to us about, how technology can be used for bullying or for stalking. Let's talk a little bit more about the negative consequence of some of these things, because I don't think people fully recognize there are some significant dangers that can come from unhealthy use of technology.
Yeah. So in the general form of bullying and harassment that can come up quite a bit, because like I mentioned earlier, like there is a sense of urgency or maybe like intensive and like just connection with someone, like having continual access to someone else.
Right.
And there isn't always a way to escape sometimes, given that, as we talked about, screens are almost everywhere.
Right.
So that can kind of show up and impact someone's sense of privacy and their sense of like safety as well. And so when we are allowing people to have access to us in terms of like our phone numbers or even our social media accounts, that gives them other avenues of ways to connect with us. And you can go as far as even like even our musical profiles on our music platforms like Apple
Right.
Music or Spotify, because that's still another avenue that someone can still reach you through.
Right.
So that is some of the things that I think that the ways that people can use technology to still get connected to someone else, that maybe it's setting a boundary of not wanting to connect with them anymore. I think that's kind of where we see some of the harm coming up quite a bit, especially when someone's like not wanting to engage with someone else anymore. So monitoring someone's location, monitoring if someone's online or offline quite a bit is something that we see quite often. We also see people harassing through just spamming messages or making fake accounts and messaging someone else again on their main account. We also see the aspect of commenting and bullying on someone's posts quite often, even blacklisting them from certain spaces online as well, certain groups. So it can get really dynamic and it can get really creative around how people can use technology to enact harm towards someone else.
Right. That can be really harmful and have some negative consequence.
Mhm.
What um what are some warning signs that, if I'm a parent or even if I'm a youth that's listening and maybe realize I don't have the best technology hygiene, let's call it, what are some warning signs that we could be looking for in ourselves or our loved ones if we're really wanting to ensure that we do have good technology hygiene?
So I'll start with teens. I think one of the main things to be important about is monitoring your mood. Thinking about how you feel before, during, and after your technology use of whatever kind that it might be. So if you're thinking about even just wanting to open up your social media accounts, how you feel beforehand. Like, do you feel pleasant about that? Do you feel neutral about it? Are you feeling some dread about it? Are you feeling some fear about it? That can kind of indicate what you're walking into on your
Right.
platform. So that's a great way to kind of gauge, like, do I enjoy this? Do I not enjoy this? And then as you're engaging with the content on your feeds or whatever it might be, um, also doing the same thing, just gauging, like, do I enjoy this? Do I not? Do I enjoy who I'm speaking to? Do I enjoy how we're speaking? Do I enjoy what we're talking about? And then also on the other end, once you're done, or once you've left the app or whatever it is that you're using, to do another check around your mood, because that can be our mood shifts throughout the day and shifts
Sure.
quite often, but it can also be a really great signal to allow us to know what's happening for us at any given moment.
Right.
And so for us to tune into ourselves and to check in to see, like, how we're feeling about something.
Well, and really using it as a barometer to understand, is this helping or hurting? Like the more you check in with that, I think you get better feedback that you can, check in with yourself to say, hey, that experience depleted me, made me angry, made me frustrated, take your pick, filled my cup, like whatever it may be. It doesn't always have to be negative. And really being able to check in around that, I think, is so valuable. And frankly, when you talk about this in relation to youth versus adults, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, we all have a relationship to technology. So, and we are also at the same time living through a lot of the things that are similar on the internet as well.
Right.
So that does connect us all as well. And so I think, yeah, it can be a very similar effect for sure.
Well, and again, I am not trying to vilify technology, but unless you tell me otherwise, I mean, as adults, we're as guilty as some of these things as youth are. Like,
Yes.
you get the emboldened adults, you get bullying, you get stalking, you get all of those things, you get the unhealthy screen amounts of screen time, etc. Are you seeing anything different revealing itself in adults you work with versus what you've seen in teens, or is it just an older version of the same stuff?
I would say it's an older version of the same stuff. I think maybe sometimes people might cope a little differently than teenagers might. Teenagers have a bit more of a flexibility with how they manage stress and distress than some adults do, just because developmentally there's more flexibility in terms of how the brain's still developing,
Right.
their bodies are still developing as well. So they're a bit more adaptive than maybe adults might be, because there's more of an entrenched sense of coping with distress or coping with disconnection or coping with bullying and harassment that might occur that has been ingrained across time. So it's a little bit harder to shift some of those interpretations of what's happening or the behavior that's happening. It can still shift, but it just sometimes there's a little bit of work that has to be done around that intentionally that maybe might be a little bit less so for folks who are a bit younger. But
I
it's
mean, I'm
absolutely.
even thinking, I love this about checking in with your mood state kind of before, in the middle of, and then after. I mean, I even think about that as an adult. And when we talk about warning signs specifically, like if you're doing those mood checks for yourself and really recognizing that there's some ups and downs in your own usage as an adult or a parent, let's say, I think it would make it easier to spot some of those negative consequences that you're seeing in your youth, right?
Yes. Yeah. Our
You know,
moods impact sometimes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Our emotions impact our behavior as well. And so that would be the second thing to look at too, like what comes afterwards that you're doing behaviorally. So it absolutely is something that can be helpful to attend to.
So I just want to be a really good resource here for, the parents that are listening. Like if you're recognizing some negative consequence that you think ties back to technology, what's the open door to have the conversation? I mean, I hear time and again, I just don't know how to have the conversation with my kid. Like, where do you start?
I think it is sometimes we can overcomplicate some of these things sometimes, because it might feel really, really big.
Right.
Um, feel like I don't know if that might be coming from a space of maybe anticipated, like, um, rejection or pushback, when you are trying to connect and kind of inquire about what's happening. So even thinking about that, of like your relationship with your child in terms of how that's impacting you. But I think even just noticing like the behavior that you might be seeing or the mood shifts you might be seeing in your child around like, hey, I'm noticing that you're seeming a bit down, you're seeming a little bit different than you did early this morning or earlier today or yesterday, whatever it might be. And I'm just curious about that. Or I'm wondering like what's been going on. Or is everything okay? Or how are you doing? How are things going with your friendships and
Right.
with your relationships in life? So that can kind of be one of the avenues to go down in terms of trying to connect and open that door.
Well, I love that. And you really validating that we don't need to overcomplicate things. What I'm hearing from you is like, let's lead with some empathy. Let's lead with non judgment. Let's have a conversation around it. Hey, here's what I'm noticing. And what I love about that approach specifically is it goes back to the heart of what we all want as humans to be valued, seen, and heard. So, when you show up and intend to have a conversation that way, it implies that I see you. Like I see that something's going on and I want to have a conversation about it. And it's just so fascinating to me that these conversations are so hard for many of us to have, when the reality is, feedback that I've gotten from youth is, my parents don't really understand, and they're on their phones and buried them as much as I am or more. So there becomes this hypocritical, like, say as I do, not, or do as I say, not as I do sort of conversation around that, which I think really kind of sets the tone for this. So I also want to underscore, I think it's probably pretty important before you get into that conversation specifically, are there things on your side of the street that you need to clean up and say, hey, I recognize that maybe I don't have good technology hygiene as well. And I noticed some of these things happening in you. Like, I think that's a really powerful place for somebody to start also, like owning your side of the street.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that too. You're also speaking to the other dynamic of the power imbalance between a parent and a child too, and how that can really influence the how communication occurs between the two.
Right.
Because there is that indifference, there might be that hypocritical stance that maybe isn't intentional, but it's coming from that space of like, well, my parents get to do this, but I can't, and that doesn't
Right.
feel okay because I also have access to the same that they do, and it can feel very stifling. It can feel very minimizing. It can feel very hurtful to
But I think it's
people.
also the thing that leads to being secretive and sneaky and, kind of some of the more negative consequences in this. And I really, I cannot stress enough, and I've worked with hundreds of teens at this point, but, I cannot stress enough how often teens will tell me that they want to have these conversations with their parents. And like, I was blown away the first time I heard that, even the second or third time, because I wouldn't have expected that to be the case. But kids are telling me, I literally want to be able to have conversations with my parents, and I don't know how. Like, that's why I think
Mhm.
it's important to have conversations like this that really, you know, being the inspiration point for recognizing, to your words, like, we don't need to overcomplicate this. Like, if you see somebody struggling, it's appropriate and okay to say, this is what I've recognized. Is there something I can do to support you? Do you want to have a conversation around it? Because I find sometimes just opening the door to have the conversation may lead to somebody telling you something that you didn't expect them to share with you.
Exactly. Much like the teens sharing how they really want to connect with their parents to you, that you
Well,
weren't
and on
probably
the parent
expecting.
and on the parent side, I hear, I don't know how to have conversations with my teen either. Like, I don't understand what they're doing. Like, I don't know what their online profile looks like. I don't know that, I think the dangerous thing that I see over and over again, and it's how we ended up with a podcast called Nobody's Perfect. I had a precursor podcast called Teen Talk, and it ran from 2019 to 2021, and it was with youth specifically. And we had fabulous conversations about this, but really recognizing and understanding, like, we have a generation of youth that want to talk about the things that they're struggling with. I mean, as we talked about earlier, peer support is the number one line of defense that youth are seeking out. Like, these are kids that are used to talking about some pretty heavy, deep things that they're going through. And I think as parents, again, not to make any parent the bad guy here, but like, your team may be prepared to have a deeper conversation than you can even imagine. You being able to show up and meet them there may be part of the challenge in figuring out what tools you need to get on board. And I think, again, that's why we're having conversations like this, is to recognize it's really important for us to see one another.
Yeah, yeah. And the reality is parents have been teenagers before. And so I wonder if that also maybe impacts maybe that sense of that fear, maybe or disconnection of not quite feeling like they can relate, maybe.
Right.
But to your point, like human to human, we can all relate if we are able to to get to that point, to open up the door of curiosity and non-judgment and empathy and compassion, and to see your child as a person as well. I think that's also a part of it. That has feelings, emotions, thoughts, opinions, and to your point, a desire to want to share with
Right.
parents around what's happening in their lives. Teenagers also are in a developmental stage where peers, like you said, peer support tends to be the highest factor for like connection and for support that they're looking for in their lives. That doesn't mean that that's the only avenue that they feel like they have to go to. And so, because there's that desire that you're talking about, that they are wanting parental support, I think just knowing that alone can be something that can help, hopefully, encourage a lot of parents to at least try to open the door to speak to their children around what their needs are and what their boundaries can be around technology, so what their even what their fears are for the.
Well, and in recognizing that you may have a pretty great built-in technology teacher in your home.
Yeah.
There are things that you want to learn about. Maybe you approach them and say, "Hey, I've noticed that you're engaged in this. That looks really cool to me. Explain it to me." Like,
Yeah.
I think as humans, we are wired to be heroes. So there is an element of asking for help. You may just get it, and that could be a connection point. Like, I just think that the world has changed so fast and is adapting so quickly that, our ability to keep up with all of that, like, it's tough. And I want to give everybody a pass of grace that's listening. Like, there is no expectation of doing this perfectly. And where I want to lead the conversation next is, let's talk about the positive benefits of technology, because there are many, and we've intimated throughout this conversation, but like, let's spell that out. Like, what are the gifts of technology and us having that access to that in our lives?
Like you mentioned earlier, just globally, just like communication, I think is a great way for us to connect with people that we might not be able to otherwise. Even people from across like different locations or states or
Right.
countries. The news that the knowledge and the news that we can consume, that we can have access to, is a lot more accessible to us because of technology, and that allows us to also connect more with people in our lives about what's happening. That, but prior to the use of technology, we probably wouldn't have access to. So I think that that really does help us grow as a society in that way, and to band together in a lot of ways that we maybe would not have otherwise. Um, and to your point, like sometimes like asking for tech support from your teenager, from your child, can be really helpful too, as a way to learn from someone else, as a way to build a deeper connection with someone as well. So it's like the main couple of things that come to my mind off the top of my head at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable. And really, just going back to what we were talking about earlier, as you think about, as a parent, stepping into those conversations and recognizing there is a perspective of modeling and really checking your own behavior before you go into those conversations, because it could lead to you getting some feedback that you really don't love either. So showing up to clean up your side of the street, frankly, is paramount.
Yeah. Yeah. We're all healing and growing, and we're all learning all the time. And so it can be a great, to your point, a great experience to learn from other people that we have in our lives, even our children. And our children can learn from us. And so I think, to your point, like there is that desire on both ends of the street, from what you've been saying so far, that people want to connect. And I think as long as you have a good relationship with your child and they have a good relationship with you, they feel safe and comfortable to come to you, and you feel safe and comfortable to go to them. I think that really does help breed that sense of connection. And it would probably eliminate that sense of maybe fear or disconnection, or sense of not feeling like, yeah, like you're as connected.
In the work that you've done, have you seen any challenges arise from the way that peers show up to support one another? I know you mentioned earlier how they'll connect them to other places of support. I mean, we've seen historically that can kind of look like sick people helping other sick people also. There are some negative consequences to that. Is there anything that you've observed that's the dark side of the peer support and showing up to support one another that maybe isn't healthy?
Think about that for a second. I think so. Like I think, coming to your point, like if people don't know, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you're tasked, or you feel like you want to support someone but not quite know where to point them to or know what to do, it can kind of create an echo chamber of misinformation, or um, a lack of tangible support in a
Right.
way that you know you would hope to get if you were going outside of the peer level support. So I think it's important to also just kind of gauge, like, it's just like an adult, it's okay to go to your friends for certain things or for support, but also knowing that there are other avenues that you can seek out for yourself. So even just like fact checking the things that you hear from people, and Googling certain things to make sure that you're not taking someone's like sole experience to mean that it has to have a certain rule or value over your experience in your life.
Mm.
And also like checking in with people that you know, trusted adults or a trusted adult in your life that you can speak to around some of these things, whether that could be a therapist, it could be another parent, it could be a cousin that's older, or it could be someone that it could be a teacher, it could be anyone that you feel connected
Right.
to that um, you trust and feel safe with to guide you through something or to talk
Well,
source.
and let's also normalize that it's completely okay to say, I don't know. If
Yes.
somebody comes to you with something that you don't know, it doesn't mean that you're not a good friend because you don't know. It's appropriate to say, I don't know. Like, let me think about that. Let me find some different resources. Like, I don't know how to support you through this. Like, isn't it important for us to normalize the fact that I don't understand or I don't know or I don't know how to support you with that? Like, I feel like we've moved into this space where there's such pressure for us to show up for our people and do and say and be the right way. And the reality is like that was never our responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of saying I don't know because that does acknowledge, because that also acknowledges like a space to grow, um, and to learn even more. Because if you don't know, so that maybe you can help someone find out whatever it is they might need or what things that can be used to help support them. So or getting connected with someone else, so it doesn't have to always fall on you or one person to support someone.
Yeah, again, I can't stress enough. I think the power of saying I don't know is really important to do this. And I want to wrap us up on this conversation that I think has been so illuminating and so valuable, and really um, acknowledging the fact that there is an element of allowing ourselves grace and allowing ourselves the time and understanding to recognize it. We have all adapted, again, many youth are natives, but as parents, we've adapted to utilizing technology. And we didn't necessarily do so with a handbook that told us how to do this perfectly or well. So frankly, there may be a gut check or a reality check that just needs to happen in today's world, in today's conversation, that kind of level sets, okay, here's where I've been, and there's some things that I don't like in my own use of technology, that allows you to show up differently for the people that you're trying to support. Like, I think it's important to recognize that there's some grace we can give ourselves in that.
Absolutely. Technology changes so quickly and so um, impact like just massively over time. And so there's no way for like to your point, there's no way for us to keep up with it all the time to know exactly how to use every piece of it at any given moment in time. So yeah, being humble and being gracious towards yourself and other people is a great thing to keep in mind as you navigate the world
Right. In all things.
and all things.
Before we wrap up here today, there's one question we ask every guest. Dr. Wilson, can you tell us what nobody's perfect means to you?
That's a great question. I love that. So nobody's perfect to me. Really, just to what we just said, like I think it's important to recognize that you don't have to know everything, and that there's no way you can know everything, and that there is no state of arrival for healing or for growth, and that we're all constantly growing, and we can change the amount of information that we have in our lives as well. So I think being flexible, and not holding yourself to a high standard all the time, I think is important because that can be really limiting and that can lead you to have more detrimental mental health concerns because we can't, perfection doesn't exist because nobody's perfect. So we cannot hold ourselves to that standard. The bar would just continually move if we did that.
I love it. And I want to thank you for making the contribution that you have today to having this important conversation around technology and technology hygiene. Again, I cannot underscore enough. Like it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And it's so important for us to continue shining a light on the good and the bad of the things that we're being faced with day in and day out. So thank you for your contribution today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being part of the Nobody's Perfect community dedicated to supporting, inspiring, and empowering youth and families. We hope you enjoyed today's transformative conversation. Together, we are dismantling stigma and providing solutions for mental health and well-being challenges so everyone can thrive. Join us every other week on cozy101.com/imperfect or on your favorite streaming platform to continue embracing our shared human experience. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, visit nobodiesperfect.community to get immediately connected to a hub of clinically approved mental health resources and tools designed to support you wherever you find yourself on your journey. And be sure to follow us on @NobodiesPerfectCommunity on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. I'm your host, Jason Hopcus. It's been a pleasure having you here. Stay connected, stay inspired, and remember, nobody's perfect because perfection isn't real. Your story is. Until next time.